Hi, I'm Chris Sarandon, and welcome to Cooking by Heart, where we revisit the vivid memories of the food we grew up with.
I couldn't believe the tastes and the flavors.
Lydia Bastianich. Hi, Chris. Susan Sarandon.
And the people and the stories attached to that time in our lives.
You know, I've been dying to chop this up with you for a while now.
Yeah.
And I would do Julia Child. This is a lovely chocolate macadamia nut truffle that has dark chocolate. You can get it in milk chocolate too. I prefer the dark.
Ladies and gentlemen, Alice Waters.
I was the one sort of like mommy dearest.
He'd order one side of the menu and eat that. And then when he was finished eating that, he'd order the other side of the menu and eat all of that. He emptied the kitchen.
Food is the thing. Come on. We know that. 10 page.
My guest today is Peter McCrea. Peter McCrea grew up in Hollywood, but more on that later. As an adult, he is the founder of SDG Global Investments, a company that arranges loans of philanthropic capital for entrepreneurs with companies aligned with the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. He also serves as president of Impact Capital, which provides services to philanthropists, while he is also a business acquisitions advisor for the $40 billion family-owned multinational corporation, the Hinduja Group. Peter has been Senior Vice President of Development at the American Endowment Foundation and was Business Development Advisor for the foundation's Source, advising philanthropic services for over 2,000 foundations that have closed over $528 million in philanthropic transactions. He's also been Executive Vice President of the Institute for Nonprofit Excellence, designing corporate social responsibility campaigns for Fortune 500 companies, and he served as chair of the Livelihoods Council at Save the Children, providing services to over 2 million women in the developing world. Peter is also a founding member of the American Cinema Awards Foundation, honoring legendary performers such as Clint Eastwood, Whitney Houston, Whoopi Goldberg, Tom Cruise, Elizabeth Taylor, to benefit the Motion Picture and Television Fund. And he coordinated the donation of his parents' ranch, the Francis and Joel McCrea Ranch, to the ranch's local recreation and parks district. The ranch is now listed on the National Register of Historic Places. I'm very, very proud to welcome Peter McCrea to Cooking by Heart. Hi, Peter.
Great to see you, Chris. Glad to be here.
Lovely to have you. And we have a kind of natural segue into the first part of our show because I normally ask everybody, first of all, provenance, where you're from, because it has so much to do with the food we eat, the way we grew up. Did you grow up in Los Angeles?
I actually grew up on the ranch that's now a park in Ventura County, which is about an hour north of LA on the way to Santa Barbara. And it was a farming and cattle ranch from way back in the day. My dad bought it in 1933 at the end of the Depression.
Right. And what is that now, even though the ranch itself has been preserved? What is the community now?
Now it's Thousand Oaks, which is in the city limits of Thousand Oaks, which is just off the 101 freeway north of the San Fernando Valley.
Right.
And there's about 400 acres of the ranch is still preserved.
Wow. Which is, these days, extraordinary, particularly given the real estate values in that part of Southern California.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, definitely.
Can you talk a little bit about growing up on that ranch? I mean, were you there from your first memory?
Yeah, that was home from day one. And I was born in LA, brought out to the ranch right after I was born, and I grew up on the ranch. My brothers, one of whom was an actor, the other became a cowboy and a rancher, were both 19 and 20 years older than I was. So they were grown and out of the house. Same mother, but I was born way late.
Right.
I was a surprise.
Your father was an actor named Joel McCrea, one of my sort of idols as an actor in so many wonderful movies from the 30s, 40s, 50s, and into the 60s, I think, yes?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And your mom, Frances D., was also an actress at the time and was very well known, but they chose to live on the ranch.
That's right. Yeah, it was really unusual. And they credited it with keeping their marriage together for 57 years because, as my dad used to say, the cattle don't care, the horses don't care, the weather doesn't care if you're a star or if you're rich or poor or successful or not. The horse will still step on you, the cow will still kick you. And, you
right.
know.
You'll still be stepping in manure.
You still step in the manure, doesn't make any difference.
Right.
So it kept them kind of grounded and level-headed. And my mom, who had been raised very poor in Chicago, her dad was in the Army, and they lived in a one-bedroom apartment. She and her sister slept on the floor of their apartment in Chicago.
Truly humble beginnings, yeah.
Very humble beginnings. And she was a city girl. So when she and Pop got married, Pop had already bought the ranch for $14 an acre, believe it or not, at the end of the Depression. At the urging of Will Rogers, who was a mentor of his and who was the biggest star at the time.
Mm-hmm.
He said, Joel, you ain't very good looking and you ain't a very good actor, but if you have some land, at least I know you'll eat. So,
so very typical of Will Rogers, both in his wisdom and also in his humor.
In his humor, no question. The original ranch was 1,000 acres, and it was a cattle ranch with what they call dry farming, which is there's no irrigation. You're relying on the weather. You're relying on the rain to grow hay or barley, things like that. So Mom, though, she used to joke about it. You know, they said, how did you as a city girl take to living out at the ranch? You know, because in those days it was a dirt road. It was an hour from the city and everything. She said, well, the first 40 years were the hardest, but then I got used to it. So, but she loved it. She really loved it. And she wanted my brothers and me to be raised in that environment. My brothers went to a one-room country schoolhouse surrounded by orange orchards. And I went to that school 20 years later when it was a 3-room country schoolhouse.
Wow.
But one of the things about growing up in that atmosphere is everything around you is about food.
Mm-hmm.
If it's cattle, if it's farming, if it's hay, if it's oranges, if it's lemons, if it's avocados.
Yeah, it's either food for you or food for something else.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. So it was all about food. Everything in the ag world is related to that.
Now, what was raised on the farm other than cattle?
Cattle and then sometimes sheep. We didn't raise the sheep, but my dad opened it up for a sharecropper sheep farmer who could come and graze. And he would graze his sheep there every year. So it was really sheep, cattle, and then hay and barley.
Right. Well, let me get back to Mom and Dad for a minute. So who was the cook? Was Mom primarily the cook?
Mom was, but also we had 2 incredible women who lived on the ranch. One was my nanny. One was the cook. And they lived on the ranch, and we had a great relationship. It wasn't like The Help in all of the heavy drama and negativity of that, but it was in that realm. It was in that world.
Right. Well, you had 2 working parents.
Yeah, they were both still, although Mom quit really right after I was born. She decided to quit acting after I was born. She got offered parts and was tempted to go back, but she decided she didn't want to. But The Help had been with us since my brothers were little, so they were part of the family. But Mom was very, very much into cooking herself. And she was really creative, but without necessarily recipes, you know. And she had a garden, organic garden. She was into health food way before it was even called health food, as far as I know. And so she wanted to have an organic garden. She wanted to have really healthy food for me and for my brothers when they were little. And she cooked on a wood stove. She loved cooking on the wood stove.
Oh, wow.
The kitchen had a regular stove, but it also had a wood stove, and she many times would prefer to cook on the wood stove.
Do you know why?
I think it was just she loved the romance of it. She loved the whole idea of it. You know, it was sort of like, well, we're on a ranch, and this is like, back to nature and back to the old days. And so I think she liked it for that reason. And there is something about it. I mean, I helped her cook on it, and so I know the feeling, and there is something about it. You're keeping an eye on the fire. You're getting the coals just right. So there's something really kind of neat about it. And Pop loved it that she wanted to do that too.
I had a live show with Jacques Pepin, the great French chef. Yeah. And his first job as an apprentice when he was 13 was to work in a wonderful restaurant near where he grew up, not in Paris, that literally had in the middle of it a giant wood stove.
Mm-hmm.
And Jacques' job was his only job, was to tend the stove, because it had a number of different ports where the wood was placed, and it had to be kept going. It had to be at a certain temperature at a certain time of day, and it had to maintain that temperature. And he had to make sure, I mean, it's an extraordinary story about that kind of symbiotic relationship between the thing that you are using to cook and the food itself.
Exactly. Yeah, there's something kind of elemental about it. I mean, you're literally dealing with fire, and you're dealing with food that was grown in the garden, and cattle that were raised, beef cattle that were raised on the ranch. So it kind of keeps that kind of feeling of connection of everything.
I want to get back to Mom and Dad and the specifics about the food and the garden and how they intertwined to create the meals that you ate. Do you remember the meals themselves when you were growing up?
We had chickens, we had a milk cow, we had the organic garden, we had cattle, all of it intertwined. I mean, I would gather the eggs, my brothers would gather the eggs when they were growing up. Later on, my mom had this notion. She said, the chickens shouldn't be cooped up in the hen house. Let's let them loose, They just let them out into the barnyard.
Right.
But at night, they would get up in the trees because they were afraid of the coyotes. So they would sit up on a branch in the tree. But in the morning, there'd be a few eggs on the ground broken. So we lost a few eggs that way. Yes. But Mom liked it that the chickens were free.
Free range, which is what we call free range now. Yeah.
Oh, yeah, they were free range. And so we would have eggs. She loved Swiss chard. She'd have sweet potatoes. She had parsley, carrots, celery. And then we had fruit trees as well. We had pomegranate trees, apricot trees, orange trees, lemon trees, grapefruit, avocado. So there was just a cornucopia of food right there, all around the house, all down around the barn area. The ranch, as I mentioned, was about 1,000 acres. It grew to be about 2,600 acres, which was, good-sized ranch, not giant, but a good-sized ranch for Southern California. But all around the house was just every possible type of food. I used to go out and pick pomegranates and, eat the pomegranates right off the tree.
I'm sitting here literally salivating.
Yeah, it was great.
And also the description of the, everything that you had nearby. It's you grew up in Eden in a way.
Oh, yeah, it really was. It really was. And I have to say, I didn't take it for granted. I did actually appreciate it because I had friends who lived up in Thousand Oaks in the town and didn't have that kind of life, but they loved to come down and visit and experience that. But literally, Mom would get the eggs. She would, make some French toast. We would have freshly churned butter. Our foreman, who was an incredible man from Missouri, who had grown up on farms himself, he would milk the cow and churn the butter. So we literally had our own churned butter and milk every day. And the kittens, there were always cats on a ranch. There's always cats around. And people would drive by the ranch and they would drop off cats. And then the cats would have kittens. We had 26 cats at one time.
Oh, my God.
But the kittens would come in when he was milking the cow. And so he would squirt milk in their mouths. It was the cutest thing. You'd have 6 or 8 kittens running around the cow, and he was squirting milk in their mouth.
In a feeding frenzy, yeah.
A feeding frenzy, yeah. And then I would bring a glass, and he would milk right into the glass, and I would drink the milk right out of just literally been in the cow 30 seconds before. And so Mom would make eggs. She'd make great French toast on the wood stove. She also made a really very basic, but it was one of our favorite meals, was sort of this cowboy stew with hamburger and kidney beans and onions and garlic, and it was really great.
Oh,
and
sounds wonderful.
She would cook that on the wood stove as well. One of the things that, I never really thought about at the time, but when you look back on it now, is you're surrounded in that kind of a life. You're surrounded by new life all the time, and the cycle of life.
Yes.
Also, there's a lot of death, and it's just kind of part of that world. The cattle are being raised; they're going to be slaughtered, and they're going to be eaten. And The plants that are growing, they go through their cycles. So you're very much in touch with that rhythm of nature, which can be, not always as pleasant as people imagine. You think of a farm, you don't think about killing as much as might happen.
We have experienced with our children and then the grandchildren the death of a pet, for instance.
Oh, yeah.
And that's somewhat different if your attention is on that one animal all the time. If it's not part of a cycle that the environment goes through constantly.
Yeah, that's right. And it really comes down to the attachment. There was a friend of mine who was a hunter, taught me how to hunt, and he said, if you name one of the calves that you're raising and you watch it grow up and it has a name, you're not going to want to see that one go off to slaughter. And I always thought that made a lot of sense, because when you identify and it's like, oh, that's my calf.
Yes.
The other thing that he said was, because I asked him about hunting, because, I learned how to hunt from a young age, and hunting in that world is very normal and natural. Yeah. It's just part of the life. And I said, I feel bad about it sometimes, because it's like you're hunting and there's an animal who's like, he said, well, are you eating the animal? I said, yeah. And he said, well, if you're not just doing it for sport, where you're just killing something and that's it.
And hanging the trophy somewhere.
Yeah. He said, no, that's a whole different motivation. And he was part Native American, and he had kind of the mentality of the old time Native American, where you thank the animal when you kill the animal, you thank it for feeding you, But he said, if you look at the difference, people that just go buy a hamburger and they don't even think about it. But that cow might have been raised in a very unhappy situation, sent to a feedlot, which is like a concentration camp.
Yes.
And then killed, very relatively inhumanely in many cases. Or would you rather be an animal out in the wild who just lives your life, having a great life, and then one day you're gone?
Yeah.
He said, which would you choose? And I thought it was an interesting dilemma. Ultimately, when I was a teenager, I decided I didn't want to hunt, and I became a photographer, a nature photographer. So I was using the same skills of tracking and hunting an animal, but taking a picture of it instead of shooting it.
Oh, how interesting.
So, yeah.
Did you follow through with that, the photography, or was that just something that you...
No, I've been a photographer ever since. I shot stills, wedding stills, nature stills, also stills on movie sets. Yeah, I'm still a photographer.
Good.
Yeah. Yeah.
It keeps that eye alive and alert. I want to go back a little bit, just in terms of around the table. Now, were you the only child at home at that time?
Yeah. My brothers would come periodically. They were either in college or then in the Army or working. They would, come back for holidays and things like that. Yeah, most of the time it was me alone with my folks.
Yeah, and your parents.
And yeah.
What was the conversation like around the dinner table, whether your brothers were there or not, essentially?
It was a lot about the ranch life. It was, with me, when I was in school, it was also obviously a lot about what's going on in school.
Yeah.
But it was really kind of a Norman Rockwell almost kind of life when I look back on it. And I know I'm probably have rose-colored glasses on, but it was really, small town. The closest local town that we would go to for shopping was only 500 people. It had two markets, one that was run by a Mexican family that catered more to Mexican ethnic food, and the other was a conventional, American market. And so that's where we do our grocery shopping. All of the businesses were locally owned. They were all mom and pop businesses. So, mom and pop around the table would be talking about what happened to the guy who ran the hardware store, or what happened to another farmer who planted the wrong crop at the wrong time and something went sideways, or somebody who was really successful unexpectedly. For example, there was a funny old man who wore ripped overalls. He had a funny old ragged hat, and he drove an old rusty pickup, and we would run into him in town when we'd be going to the market. He had about, I think, 1,000 acres up on the side of this mountain. And he kept saying, Pop, he said, Joel, you ought to buy, I'd like to sell you my land. He said, would you like to buy it? And Pop knew that it was terrible grassland for cattle.
Right.
So he kept putting him off and telling him, no, I'm sorry, I'm not interested. A few years later, we run into him in town, and he's driving a Cadillac. He's all dressed up. And Pop says, boy, things are looking good. He said, yeah, you remember that 1,000 acres I was trying to sell you? They struck oil on it.
I had a feeling that's where this story was going.
Yeah. So, so they would talk about those kind of things around the table. They'd laugh about it. They never cared. They were not acquisitive people,
Right. And the talk also wasn't about show business.
Very little. Although, sometimes it would come up, but surprisingly little about show business. It was really about the ranch life, because that was what they were living every day.
It's so interesting to me that a way of life that is rapidly disappearing.
Yeah.
And I'm sure you know as well as, or more than anybody, about how the acquisition of a big agricultural conglomerate, acquiring land and the small farmer, etc., how this way of life is virtually, if not non-existent, it certainly doesn't exist in the same way as it did back then.
Yeah, definitely.
And the fact that you were connected to the people who were part of your community in a very integral way was also important.
Yeah. Really, I would say probably 80-90% of the kids I went to school with were directly or indirectly related to the ag world. And it was a very diverse community, too. It was really interesting when I look back on it. There was a Japanese family who actually the parents had been interned in the internment camps. I don't know how it happened, but they had a farm before the war. And then, a lot of the Japanese families, their properties were lost. They were just taken over by somebody.
Right.
But their farm stayed, and they came back and farmed. A lot of Mexican background families, a lot of Latino background families, and all different types of crops. My brother worked in the bean fields. Actually, both my brothers did. There was a Mexican gentleman who owned a farm near us, and Mom and Pop encouraged the boys to go work in the bean fields, hoeing beans alongside the Mexican laborers. And that was a great experience for them. There were really pretty much any kind of crop because the weather is so great. And that location in Ventura County is one of the most fertile areas in the country, really. It's called the Oxnard Plain. This is the beginnings of the Oxnard Plain.
Oh, I had no idea.
Some of the most fertile land.
I mean, we always think of the Central Valley in California as being the breadbasket.
It is, and it's by far bigger. In terms of pure fertility, the Oxnard Plain is phenomenal.
Any idea why geologically it was that fecund fertile?
I don't know, because all fertile plains are essentially the silt that runs off from the mountains and valleys above they create that topsoil. It just happened to be the combination. There were a lot of the ranch actually had volcanic rock on it, a lot of volcanic rock. And maybe that had something to do with it. Also, that whole area, the ranch had been underwater millions of years ago. And I used to find fossils on the ranch. So it was both underwater and it was volcanic. So maybe the mix of the volcanic and the silt. Yep, it might have made the soil richer.
How interesting.
Yeah.
You went to school at a 1-room or 3-room by that time schoolhouse.
Yep.
What did you do for school lunch? Did Mom pack for you?
There was a phenomenal couple who lived on the property. Lived on the school property. They had a house on the school property, and that house had been the 1-room schoolhouse. In their living room was the school when my brothers went there. Later on, the area grew. They built the 3-room schoolhouse. So there was 1st and 2nd grade, 3rd and 4th grade, 5th, 6th, 7th, and 8th grade were all together.
Right.
Mrs. Noakes and her husband, Mr. Noakes. Mr. Noakes drove the school bus. Mrs. Noakes was the cook. And we had essentially home-cooked meals every day at school.
Wow.
Incredible.
That's extraordinary.
Yeah. And the 8th graders were like the waiters and cleaning up and doing the dishes and serving and all of that.
Oh, my.
Yeah, and it was an incredibly good food. I mean, really, we used to look forward to it.
I think you may be the only guest I've ever had who spoke about looking forward to school food.
Yeah. We would look forward to it, absolutely, because she was such a great cook and just the nicest person too. So
How extraordinary.
yeah.
You and I have talked before, and you mentioned that there were people who would come to the ranch, there were people who were in the movie business who would come and visit your parents at the ranch.
Yeah.
As a kind of refuge. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. Gary Cooper and my dad were both very good friends. They were up for a lot of the same parts, but they were very good friends, never any competitiveness or anything like that. Pop used to joke about it. He'd say, if they wanted to have Cooper do a picture and he's busy, then they send the script to me. So he's like the second choice behind Cooper.
Right.
But they'd both been, around horses and cattle. They're growing up. Cooper was from Montana and worked on ranches. And so they both knew horses. They both knew the West. And Pop actually grew up in Hollywood, on Hollywood Boulevard, when it was a dirt road, a dead-end dirt road.
Really?
And he worked on the road crew that extended that dirt road to Laurel Canyon. And then he worked in hayfields and on cattle ranches as a young man in high school. So he always wanted to be a cowboy, always wanted to have a ranch, but he realized that he was never going to be able to make enough money as a cowboy to be able to buy a ranch. Then he got into the movie business and he made enough money that he could afford to buy it. Mm-hmm. Cooper would come out to the ranch. He would just show up, and he wouldn't call or anything. He would just show up. And Mom would fix him lunch. He'd lie in the hammock down. We had a great pool that was built like a pond. So it had sloping sides. It was like a pond, and there was a hammock down there. Coop would go and take a siesta in the hammock, and then Pop would go off and work on the ranch, and Mom and Coop would visit about things. And then Mom did Little Women with Katherine Hepburn, and she and Katherine Hepburn became friends. So Hepburn and Tracy would come out now and then.
Spencer Tracy,
yeah.
Right.
Walter Brennan, who had done a couple of pictures with Pop, he had a ranch, grapefruit ranch, near ours, just about a mile away. So he would come by. He was a really fun, great guy.
Oh, sounds like it.
Maurice Chevalier, who...
Interesting.
He had picked Mom. He saw her in the commissary, and there was a picture that he was starring in. He was a huge star at the time. Mm-hmm. The woman who was supposed to play the part opposite him couldn't do the part, and he saw Mom across the Paramount commissary, and he said, I'd like to talk to her. I'd like to see if she could play the part. And she got it, and they became friends for decades. So he would come out to the ranch.
Wow.
Yeah.
First of all, how extraordinary. Lana Turner at the soda fountain stories. Mm-hmm. They are legendary, and sometimes they happen. Sometimes they were a product of an ambitious PR person at a studio. But in this case, the fact that Maurice Chevalier literally saw your mother and picked her out of a crowd, and she became a movie star as a result.
Yeah. Wow. Absolutely. It was one of those things. I'm getting off the food side of things. I don't.
Oh, that's quite all right, because they came for the respite. They came to escape, obviously, the stresses of Hollywood and the studio system and the constant work, because the work was, if you were signed at a studio, was fairly constant.
Oh, yeah.
Was your dad a product of that as well?
Yeah. Pop was under contract, I think, first with MGM, and then he moved to Paramount. Mm-hmm. He and Mom were both at Paramount for a long time. RKO for a while, and those were kind of the main ones. He was under contract at Goldwyn for a while. But yeah, they both lived within the studio system at that time.
Mm-hmm. Did they meet as a result of having worked together, or?
The way they met was interesting, because Pop had a friend who was a film editor, and they got together one time, and this editor said, Joel, he says, there's a movie you've got to see. It's called An American Tragedy. Mm-hmm. And he said, there's a girl in it that's so beautiful. You're going to go see the movie. You're going to fall in love with her. Mm-hmm. He literally said that. So Pop was very curious about this. So he went to the movies and saw it and was very smitten right away.
Yes.
That movie was later remade as A Place in the Sun with Montgomery Clift and Elizabeth Taylor.
Based on the Dreiser novel?
Exactly, yeah. And Mom was in the Elizabeth Taylor part. Mm-hmm. So later he sees her at the beach, and they were both beach people. And Mom was at the beach doing stills bathing suit stills.
Mm-hmm.
And Pop loved to body surf. So he's down at the beach. He sees her and comes over. They introduce him, and there was more sparks. Now there were more sparks. And then David Selznick, who both of them worked for, kept telling Pop, he said, that's a great girl for you. You ought to go for her.
Mm-hmm.
And Pop said, well, she's terrific. He says, but David, you cast the movies, I'll cast my marriage. But he was really taken. And then they were cast in a movie together by Selznick later. And that's when it really took off.
So Selznick, in a way, was kind of the matchmaker, or at least started to kindle the flame anyway.
Yep.
So in the meantime, just chronologically, as you're growing up on the ranch and your mom is providing organic from the garden, you guys are eating organically from the land, both what the animals are producing and also the animals themselves.
Yep.
Other than the ranch hash or whatever you want to call that great sort of hamburger meat plus, the kitchen sink that you love so much. Any other standout dishes that you remember that your mom and dad came up with?
Yeah, Mom used to make chicken paprika.
Oh.
And that was one of my favorite things. She and Pops too. Somehow, I don't know what she did, but it was chicken and paprika and sour cream and onions and...
Very Hungarian.
Yeah, very Hungarian. And it was one of the favorite dishes. Pop had a bunkhouse. There was an old bunkhouse, 100-year-old bunkhouse that he used as sort of his office and like his man cave, and he would cook as well. He would cook in there, very simple things, but he'd make scrambled eggs or he'd have breakfast sometimes if he'd be up early. And he'd cook lunch for me sometimes, make a tuna sandwiches, things like that. But, when you're in that world, it's not so much about the recipes. It's the fact that you're incredibly hungry because you're working outside all the time. Right. And everything tastes great.
Yes.
And when I was hunting, I would hunt for things that I would then cook it for him, A part of that world was Pop and I in his bunkhouse cooking and eating as well. Mom didn't venture in the bunkhouse. It was sort of like that
off limits,
off limits in a way. Yeah. She'd come in and make sure it was clean, but she would leave it alone.
I'm assuming you matriculated at some point. Did you go away to college?
Yeah, I went away to college in the Midwest and then came back and finished college in film school near the ranch, actually. Went to film school, and then I went to work in the film business as an editor. I worked in production. I never wanted to be an actor, but I liked the photography side. I did still photography. I did documentary cinematography, and I did editing. So I got into the film business after college.
How long did you work in the film business?
About 10 years or so, 10, 12 years.
How did this transformation occur from being in the film business to what you're doing now, which couldn't be further from that? How did that happen?
I always had an interest in things that were kind of beneficial to the world. It wasn't like pure philanthropy, but I just want to be involved in things that were like positive for the world. And Pop always chose film projects that were, he always said, I want to do something that has something to say, that sort of maybe uplifts people or enlightens people. He would choose scripts like that. He would choose parts like that. And Mom was very philanthropic. Mom was extremely philanthropic. She was always helping people. Both of them were. They donated 20 acres of the ranch to the YMCA for an outdoor activity center. They donated to build a gymnasium for the Boys and Girls Club. And they were just very philanthropic. They gave scholarships. So I was around that whole kind of mentality. And so whatever business I was in, I was always looking for ways to do things that were going to benefit the world as well as being good business. And that evolved into what is called now impact investing, which is where you're investing philanthropic capital, which is like money from foundations, into for-profit businesses that are doing good things. So not just giving it to a nonprofit, but investing it in a for-profit that's doing good. So that's really my work now. And it just came out of my, life on the ranch and being around two great people. So
many of the, as I'm reading your biography, almost everything that you've done in the last how many years, and I'm assuming it's a number of years, have been associated in some way with guiding philanthropy. You essentially putting philanthropy together with needy groups.
Yeah. So I'll give you an example. There are projects that we're working on in the ag space now in my current business where we're arranging loans for agricultural companies that are doing sustainable organic agriculture. One of the projects that we're raising funding for is a project in India where they're converting conventional chemical farmers to organic natural farming, non-chemical farming. And I'm working with an incredible man he was formerly with the UN, and they've literally converted 1.5 million farmers out of 5 million in this part of India from chemical agriculture to organic natural agriculture. And the great thing about it is the yields have gone up.
Yep.
The nutrition quality is better. The costs have gone down, and they're using less water, no chemicals. And so there's this huge benefit and this whole huge ripple effect. The farmers are making more money by doing it right.
Yes. And their health is probably better as well.
Health is improved. Everything is better. And he's just an amazing man. That's the type of people that we look to fund.
Right.
That are doing that type of thing.
And there's this particular individual who is spearheading it in India, and you guys are essentially funding his efforts?
That's right. We're raising money to fund his effort. Yeah.
Right.
But it's on a for-profit basis, which is a little different than granting money to a nonprofit. So
right.
Yeah.
You know, on a much smaller level, we give money to various things over the year of organizations like Heifer and Finca, which are sort of much more kind of micro.
Yep. Finca is phenomenal. Both of those are great organizations. Anytime you help what they call people at the bottom of the pyramid, which is essentially people that are really attached to the land.
Yep.
They're not dependent on getting a job. They're growing their own food. Anytime you can help people in those scenarios, like Finca does with microfinance, is phenomenal.
Yeah.
And the ripple effects up are tremendous.
Yeah.
You know?
Oh, they are. Yeah, absolutely. And not only in those people's lives, but in everything that they, every way in which they associate in their communities.
That's right.
And Heifer is an organization, and I'll just say this for my listeners and viewers, that they give animals to people, but animals that are productive, that provide milk or food in some way or other that allow the person to become self-sufficient. Finca provides small business loans particularly for women.
Yep, that's right.
All over the world.
Yeah.
As I was looking through this, your extraordinary business life, I saw something about the group in Save the Children, which provides services for 2 million women in the developing world. What did they do?
Yeah, the livelihoods department at Save the Children is almost identical to what Finca does. Mm-hmm. So it's microfinance, but it's also advisory services for primarily in agriculture. So they're helping women, millions of women, primarily women, who are growing food, feeding their families, helping the economics of the family and their village and community. And so it's all about 90% of it is around food, whether it's making loans to those women who want to say one wants to start raising chickens and another one wants to start raising vegetables. They get a loan that then they can start their business.
Right.
And then there's agricultural assistance. And one of the things I liked about Save the Children is that about 90% of the people who work with the people on the ground are local people. So it's not like people shipped in from Westport, Connecticut saying, here's how you should be doing things. It's like, no, we'll give you the bigger picture support and structural support and finance, but
you figure it out. Yeah.
Local people know better.
Yeah. Then you also mentioned earlier carbon capture.
Yeah.
Is your company also involved in philanthropy for that?
Yeah, there's a great organization called the Carbon Cowboys, and you can look it up on YouTube. I highly recommend looking at these videos of farmers and ranchers who are grazing their stock in a way that mimics nature. Because when you think about the buffalo or the antelope or deer in an unfenced natural world like the U.S. used to be, they were grazing and walking all along. And then they wouldn't come back maybe for 2 years to that same spot. And so it would they would trample the vegetation, eat what they ate as they walked along,
Right.
and then it would have a long time to rejuvenate. So ranching, typical cattle ranching, the way we did it, which was not done that way at that time, was, you have the cattle out in pasture and they would graze it down. You would give it time to rest. You'd move them to a different pasture. But you wouldn't give it as long a rest period and not move them as frequently.
Right. And you were more looking in terms of when they finished grazing that particular area, then you move them someplace else. It wasn't about rejuvenating that area.
No. But what the great thing is that there's a terrific TED Talk by a man named Alan Savory. It's a great name, Savory.
Yes, right.
He has a great TED Talk about that specific subject, and they've measured the benefits to the topsoil and also the ability for the soil to absorb and hold carbon. Because when you continually plow and disc the soil and plant it and then put chemical fertilizer, which poisons all of the natural microbes and everything,
right,
and it really creates a dead zone of its own kind for the soil. So the approach that he uses is this, what they call rotational grazing, where you continually move the animals. And it's phenomenal in terms of the benefits all across the board. Preserving topsoil, absorbing carbon. The animals are happier and healthier. So it's a great system.
There's a chapter in Michael Pollan's book, The Omnivore's Dilemma, where he talks about the farmer who does this with his chickens. He has a movable chicken coop. And
it's
literally
phenomenal.
The chickens defecate in that one place, and then he moves the coop, and that area rejuvenates, the soil rejuvenates, and he moves it someplace else. It makes so much sense.
It's absolutely, and it's on wheels. The coop is on wheels.
Yeah.
See, Mom would have loved that when she said, "Let the chickens out."
Right.
That would have been the compromise, is you have a moving coop.
Yeah, exactly. Right, a movable feast, as it were.
Yep. That's right.
And I had one more question about the things you do, and then I'm going to have to conclude just in terms of time. But you started something called the American Cinema Awards?
Yeah, there was a man I knew who he loved old-time movie stars, and he wanted to honor actors, initially wanted to honor actors who he felt had been under-recognized. That they had had great careers, they'd never won an Oscar, they'd never, weren't as famous as the very top of the top, but they had great careers. And so he decided to honor Mom and Pop as two of those first ones. And so that evolved into this organization where it was phenomenal events where there would be about 300 or 400 actors from all areas, television, film, stage.
Right.
They would get together and have these incredible parties, raising money for the Motion Picture and Television Fund, which has a hospital and assisted living for retired people from the industry.
Right.
That became a very, very popular event back in the day.
Again, for my listeners and viewers who are not aware of it, very often we think of particularly the movie and television business as the stars.
Yeah.
And the fact is that there is not only a huge number of people who are in support of that, but also there are actors who do the background, who do small parts, and who make their living throughout their lives in those roles, who end up not necessarily having the nest egg that the big stars do.
Exactly.
And who need help when they retire.
That's right. One of the things that I remember so distinctly is there would be some of the biggest stars, old time like Betty Davis, or singing stars like Whitney Houston or Prince, and you didn't realize it, but when you would see them in a room with a whole bunch of other actors and performers, you didn't realize who was a fan of who else. So Betty Davis would go over to a soap actor and say, "Oh my God, I love you. I love your performance. You're phenomenal." And they're going, "Betty Davis loves my performance."
Right. Yeah.
And it was really cool to watch, And then Clint Eastwood is congratulating, someone who he'd seen on a musical show. And you go, wow, Clint is a fan of somebody.
Yeah. Everybody's a fan of somebody.
Everybody's a fan of somebody.
Yeah, exactly. I'd love that. Yeah. Especially the image of Betty Davis going over to a soap actor and lauding them and how much it means to that person. means
Absolutely.
The world.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. I always conclude these podcasts with a question.
Mm.
And I'm sure in your case, you're going to have any number of possibilities, but I'll throw it out to you. If there is, as you've lived your life as an adult, a moment when you have experienced a meal or just passed through somewhere where you smelled something that brought you back to a time when you were a child, and that food experience when you were a child, what would that moment be?
Whenever I see trout on a menu,
Mm-hmm.
I was taught how to fish by the chief of the Shoshone Indians, which is an incredible honor.
Oh, wow.
And by the way, when I say he was the chief, he was the most regular guy. You think of, in our minds but he was incredibly down to earth, incredible man. And he taught me how to fish. And with a willow pole, no fancy equipment, a willow pole, catch a grasshopper, put it on the hook, and then how to sneak up on the fish in the mountain stream. And it was a very specific way of fishing. And I got really good at it. And I would catch maybe 6 or 8 fish a day in a given time. And I would bring them back to the ranch house, and we would have them for dinner. And that whole experience of being out there with him, catching a fish, bringing him home, having them for dinner cooked with bacon and cornmeal and, things like,
My mouth is watering as you describe it.
Yeah. On the wood stove,
Yes.
It's like, it doesn't get any better than that.
Well, and you're also talking about a chain of life that goes back not hundreds, but thousands of years.
Yeah.
Particularly with that particular man, but just in terms of humankind.
Yeah.
And how resonant that must be.
Oh, yeah, definitely.
And how extraordinary.
Yeah, I'm so lucky.
Yeah. With that, Peter McCrea, I'm going to thank you so very much for being on Cooking by Heart, sharing these extraordinary experiences that you had when you were a young man, and also how you have, in a way, carried forward that view of life, that sense of sustainability, and how important it is that we take care of the land and its inhabitants. I thank you for that. I thank you both for your memories and also for what you do.
It's nice of you to say that. Thank you so much, Chris. It was a great pleasure to be with you.
Thank you, Peter McCrea.